back to another episode of The Scorekeepers. On this episode, join me, Daniel Farrell, as I speak with Emmy Award winning composer Marcus Bagalà. Marcus has been working in the podcast scene in New York for several years at places such as Gimlet, which is now owned by Spotify, and most recently Realm. And he's a real pioneer for music in the podcast space. I'm super excited to get a glimpse into his creative process and have him on the show. Welcome to The Scorekeepers. Welcome to the show, Marcus, our very first podcast composer speaking with us. So before we dive on in, please just tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
So where to start? Yeah, I'm a composer, primarily known for podcasts, although it's not all that I do. I went to the Berklee College of Music and studied film scoring. So that's kind of like my baseline almost. Got into this because when I was like 12, which is probably too young, I saw Gladiator, and I heard the score and I was like, oh my God, I was like, the movie's cool, but like the thing about the movie that stuck out the most and made me so excited was like how the music like told the story and just made everything feel like so like epic and emotional. And I really sort of like tuned into that. I was like, yeah, like I think I want to do that. So I went to Berklee to do film scoring. And then it's basically like I sort of somewhere in the Berklee journey, I realized, like I wasn't quite as interested in like the big sort of like sweeping orchestral scores that most of my classmates were into. There was one class that was like a music technology class that got into really like into like synthesis and using like non-traditional instruments and things like that in scores. And
I think a lot of people come into the film scoring and they're like, I want to write like John Williams for everything, not realizing that like that's a very small portion of the industry that wants that.
It is. It's a super small thing. But I think, at the time when I was in school, it was like I started college before The Social Network won the Academy Award.
That's a good. So Social Network is such a good pre and post.
Yeah. It totally was, because at the time it was like, I guess like, so there's like some TV scoring and stuff, which is like a little more, found creative ways to get around like the smaller budgets. But I think the reality was like everyone was into orchestral music that was at Berklee. And then as I was about to graduate, The Social Network won the Academy Award. And I had this like moment where I was like, oh my God, like synth scores are a thing. I mean, like obviously they'd been a thing before that point, but like it really sort of like cemented that into my head. And I sort of like went out into the world as like a freshly like shorn college student. And I was like, okay, cool. Like what can I do to like do stuff like that? And I ended up moving to New York instead of LA. For a lot of reasons. Like one of them was like my girlfriend, who's now my wife, was an actress, and she wanted to.
My fiance is a Broadway costume person.
Oh, so perfect! Like,
not much else. not much else where we can go.
No, exactly. So I would like so we moved here, and I was like, how can I do the film scoring thing here when everyone else that I know is moving to LA and they're like getting internships with composers and doing that whole sort of like career track. And I kind of kicked around a little bit and I like sort of dabbled in commercial, TV commercials, and like that didn't really stick. And then I was like a engineer at like a audio engineering school for a little while where I was sort of like running their studios, and like that was the thing. And then I finally, one of the like two composers and like all of that are like based in New York City was looking for a composer's assistant. His name is Marcelo Zarvos. And I ended up working for him for about a year and a half. And I kind of got my like film scoring, composer's assistant experience. It was very intense, and I learned a lot. Worked on a bunch of great shows. I worked on Ray Donovan. I worked on The Affair.
Wow.
Worked on a bunch of movies. So like I really got like, I think, in a year I worked on like 10 projects or something. It was really quick, and it was super fast paced. And it was just like, I think I realized that sort of like at the tail end of that, I was like, this is
right.
I'm not putting my name on any of these projects, which I like sort of in hindsight, I was like a little naive that I at like 23 or 4, I was like really worried about like putting my name on a project and like, making sure I was making my mark instead of just sort of building up credits. I was really worried about it at the time. And I started thinking about like, what is like something that's somewhat like scoring that I'm doing here with Marcelo, right, that maybe has like a slightly lower barrier to entry, to like be the composer and like get to like make the creative decisions. And basically like right as I was transitioning out of that job, my wife, Megan, was like, you have to, this podcast, like there's this podcast. First of all, I'm like, what's a podcast? And then second, she's like, yeah, it's called Serial. It's this like really like deep, like investigated story. And it's amazing. And you should listen to it. And so I started listening to Serial. And again, I was like, this is like, I think there's like a certain like cockiness of youth that I very like much like benefited from, where I was like, oh yeah, this is great. I could totally write music for this. And that sort of like set me down the path of like trying to figure out like how I could be the guy who writes music for podcasts. And yeah, I had sort of like a series of like lucky breaks. Like the first thing that happened was I had a friend, Martin Fowler, who's another composer who does really, really great work for podcasts. And he scored a show called Limetown, which was like another sort of like early like breakout sort of in that like serial wave of shows. And it was an audio fiction. And so I reached out to him and I was like, hey, I'm getting out of this like composer's assistant job and I'm trying to figure out how to like patch it together. Do you have any recommendations about like how I could get into this like podcasting thing? And Martin was like, he emailed me back immediately and he's like, yeah, so I just met Ira Glass from This American Life at an event and they need composers because they have to replace all their music that they've been using because they're turning the show into a podcast. And I mean, so like basically what was going on there is for the longest time, This American Life had been a radio show. The music in the show when it was on the radio was covered by like radio licensing. Mm-hmm. So they didn't have to, I guess they didn't have to license it in the same way that you do when you're licensing music for a podcast. But because they wanted to start releasing the show as a podcast, they needed to very quickly generate a library of music that they could score their shows from. So they hired Marty, they hired me, a couple other composers, and we just wrote music for them. Like, I don't know, I think I wrote something like probably like 60 or 70 tracks. Wow. Like over the course of like a year and maybe about 2 years, just going back and forth with them and sort of like helping them build this library of like custom scoring that they could use to like build their shows. And that was really like sort of like my first experience like writing music for a podcast. So I basically got to learn how to write podcast music from like Ira Glass and which was a really like great primer into the like everything else that happened after that. Yeah, and it was Ira and then this really fantastic producer by the name of Jonathan Menjivar, who's at Pineapple Street Media now. He was the first person that I worked with there. Mickey Meek was another person who was extraordinarily generous with me and like really helped me like understand like how music like functions in like these like audio only stories, or how it can function. I think sort of since then the remit of music in podcasts has like really grown, but there was like sort of some very specific, interesting sort of limitations that they put on us as composers that really like helped me define like who I sort of, my voice as a composer. Like I really sort of, it like helped me figure it out, because I was like, immediately they're like, you know, sustained strings don't really work in the radio because it takes up a lot of space, and like I don't know, there was like some other things too, and I sort of just immediately like clicked, and I was like, oh yeah, I do know how to do this. Yeah, so it was a really lucky break. I mean, I worked for them for a while, and then I sort of started to realize that if I wanted to have like a proper like career in podcasts, most of the composers who were writing music for all the shows that I liked were also the audio engineers for the shows. So this is a pretty common pairing in podcasts. So I was like, okay, I guess I have to learn how to be a podcast engineer. So then I like took a little bit of time, and I like started a podcast with some friends, and like used that as like my like a chance to like cut my teeth and like mix a show. And then a couple of years later, I got a chance to join a team as a freelancer at Gimlet Media, which is another like big podcasting company. And from there, I like worked on a bunch of shows with them as a freelancer. And then I got brought on staff, and I was with them for about 4 years. I worked on a lot of really great stuff. Then there was a pandemic, and that really changed, you know, the sort of vibe of everything. And and then I sort of really was taken with this, specifically this whole like fiction scene, which has not sort of traditionally been a huge part of the podcasting ecosystem, you know, throughout the years as I've been working in it. And only in the last couple, like maybe like 2 or 3 years, has fiction really seen a lot of like really, really rapid growth. And I sort of like was looking to do something else. I wanted to sort of stop being an engineer, because that was never really what I sort of came to podcasting to do in the first place. So I took an opportunity to jump over to Realm, which is where I'm now, where I'm the music supervisor as well as like in-house composer. And I'm also a producer there. And yeah, it's been a really, really nice sort of like change of pace to go from like, you know, I was just mixing more than anything else. I was mixing at Gimlet. Like the last thing I did there is I was part of the Wall Street Journal, the Journal team. And I was like mixing that show, which was like a lot of fun, because it was like you wake up in the morning and they hand you an episode and you mix it, and they edit the episode, and then you mix it again, and then the show gets released by 4 p.m. So it was like this like very like intense, like fast paced thing. But I think I was really looking to do more sort of like creative work first.
Right.
So I was like, okay, it's time to like make a change and figure out what the next thing is. And yeah, and Realm really sort of like showed up at exactly the right time. And awesome. And like asked me to join the team, and it was really, really cool to sort of be with them. And like since I've started working for them, like I've worked on a shit ton of shows and in a very short amount of time, and we're working at cooking up some really, really exciting stuff in the next you know, like year or so. That's I guess that's the story so far.
I mean, that's great.
Yeah.
You actually predicted a bunch of my questions, so perfect.
Oh, sweet. Love that.
But talking about like your role at Realm and being the sort of in-house music composer, I was wondering if you could kind of walk us through what is the process like for getting together music for a podcast show.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing I would say is there's like a couple different processes that we go through when we're trying to like get music into a show. And it really depends on the type of show that we're doing, how big it is. Budget is obviously a big piece of the puzzle. Yeah, like sort of like what resources, how quickly it has to come together. And these are all like things that me as a music supervisor am sort of like weighing when we're looking at a project. Is like, okay, like what's our schedule look like? When is the show coming out? And then I have to kind of like, how much money do we have on hand? And then I have to sort of sit down and say like, okay, what are the things that I can pull on to make this happen? I can score it. That's one of the options, which is like, I love to score shows, obviously. But also like, I can't score everything, nor should I score everything.
Right.
I'm very much a sort of, I have to take a pretty like hard eye to something and go like, yeah, is this something that actually makes sense for me to score, both based on who I am, what I do? So that's something we think about a lot. Can it be a library? We try not to do, in a perfect world, it's like none of our shows, we have to be careful because I don't want to like shit on libraries, because like libraries are such a vital sort of important piece of what we do and how we do it. And like, we basically will use libraries on all of our shows, but the difference is like some shows we're using libraries specifically to like fill like diegetic music needs, where it's like, okay, there's music.
When you're saying libraries, do you mean like a production library that you're going to, or do you mean like a composer creating a library?
So yeah, I'm talking about like a production library.
Gotcha.
So like, yeah, like we work with West One. They're really great. I absolutely love working with them. Worked with a bunch of other great libraries in the past. Yeah, and they help fill like a lot of different needs for us. Like I said, but I think the biggest is when I'm looking for music to fill in like the music that I wouldn't necessarily write, or that we wouldn't ask another composer to write, when it's like, oh, yeah, like mostly diegetic music, I think is the biggest thing. If it's like a piece of music that's supposed to sound like a song, we like to try to either like theoretically like go to an artist that we could work with, or like work with a library that works with artists or something like that to fill that need. So basically like, yeah, like once we figured that out, there's like a couple different ways that it could go down, like was that. So like one is like me writing the music for the show, which is nice for us. I mean, like it's nice for me creatively, like I like doing it. But the other thing is like, because I'm in-house, we have a little bit more like leeway to like, I can usually write more music than I would like comfortably ask most composers who come in and to write for us, just sort of like based on the budgets we use. Sometimes it's like, we're like, we want to work with really amazing people, but like, we also want to make sure that we're not like over asking,
right,
stepping on their goodwill. So yeah, so like with me, I like when I'm doing composing for Realm, we tend to do sort of like a more like immersive thing, where I will sort of start the process by writing a scoring library for the show, where it's like, we're going to talk about all the themes, or sit down with the director, and we're going to figure out like, what are the big things we're like talking about in this show? Who are the key players? What's the plot? And like, so I can kind of like immerse myself in like what the show is. And then from that point, I'll go and just write a bunch of themes and ideas that can kind of sort of give us like the core idea of the show. And then from that library, hopefully we'll be able to sort of create the bones of like what is going to be scoring the episodes. And then once the show gets into production and we start building the show, so right, and for fiction podcasts specifically, it's like we record the show, then we have a really great in-house dialogue editor who will like do like an assembly of the show and sort of get all the dialogue in place. And then once we have all the dialogue in place, I'll sit down with the director and the sound designer. And then sometimes we'll work with a freelance music editor who kind of like helps me stay on track, because I work on a lot of different things, sort of like on a weekly basis. And we'll sit down. We'll have like a weekly meeting where we'll like talk through the whole episode. We'll just sit there with the script and say like, okay, music will go here. And like, as we're doing this, we're like making a cue sheet. I mean, it's like not... It's interesting. It's like very similar to like how you do like a spotting session for a film in a lot of ways. But the difference is like we're instead of like watching a cut, we're just reading the script, which is like a different thing because there's no sound design at this point. So like it's a little hard. Like you can listen to people talking, you know, and you can kind of get the sense a little bit of the rhythm of it. But so much of the action in fiction podcasts come from how the sound design works and how it affects the pacing and how sort of everything comes together. It's really not super useful to just sit there and like listen to an assembled like dialogue edit.
I agree. Scripts are way easier to work with.
Exactly. Yeah. So we'll like sit with the script and really like analyze it and okay, like maybe like does this theme make sense here? And you know, just well, maybe not. Like let's try this instead. And what we'll do is we'll like come up with like a scoring plan after that meeting where it's like, okay, like first of all, I have to look at my schedule and say like, how much time do I have this week to write for this show? And then so then we'll say, okay, cool, I can write like 3 cues. And then, you know, the rest will either say we're going to reuse tracks, which is very similar to how like TV scoring works. You know, you have a music editor, they're, you know, doing like reworks of old pieces and they're sort of like temping the show and kind of figuring out how it's going to set up. So yeah, so basically like we'll come up with our scoring plan. The music editor will go and sort of like lay in anything that's already been composed. And then me go and just compose 2 pieces. And usually it's like I'll do a mix. It's like, depending on how like action heavy it is, sometimes I'll just compose to the dialogue edit because it's like it doesn't need to be like super tight to the action. Like if it's like scoring out of a dialogue scene or, you know, something like that, it's not absolutely necessary to be scoring to sound design. But then if it's a big actiony scene, then usually I have to wait until the sound designer. So it's usually like, I don't know, like a couple days later until they've done their pass of the episode. Then I can take that and then I'll sort of score to pick.
Right.
And sort of make sure that, you know, the music is really working. Like, actually, I guess I can give you like a sort of fun example for the show that I'm working on right now. It's called Blood Forest. The first episode is live. Now I'm not sure, you know, I'm sure more will be live by the time this is out, but there's in like the 3rd episode, there's this like 7-minute sequence that sort of like goes to like the end of the episode. And the sort of need for this like 7-minute sequence, it's like there's like 2 parallel storylines that you're just sort of like hearing some of it, cut to the other one, then they sort of cut back and forth. But there needed to be this like sort of like rising like dread through the whole scene,
kind of glue it all together.
Yeah, and it just kind of like, it was hard because, you know, it like sort of culminates in this like big moment of action where like someone gets hit by a car and then people get eaten by werewolves. Like it's a werewolf show, you know? And it's like, there was a lot there, and it just took a lot to like, I really had to like hear it all put together to like sort of properly like sequence it. And so but that was like an example of a thing where it's like, you weren't really going to be able to put that together from like the sort of library that we had built, because it was just a very intricate scene and had all these like shifts in perspective and things like that.
Is there a little bit more give and take in the podcast world where if you need, you know, maybe a sound effect move back or forward, or is there a lot more flexibility with the editing than, you know,
there is
film?
I think it's kind of a mix, because it's like, on one hand, like particularly like when I was at Gimlet, it's like, yeah, like I'm also mixing this show, you know, so I have some like editorial like ability to be like, yeah, I'm just gonna shift this
scooch that over,
make everything work. And it's a little different at Realm. I think part of it, like, you know, partially like we have a very like integrated team, so like I work very closely with our sound designer Rory, so like there's there is a little bit of that where if I was like to, we're all on Slack. So like Slack him and be like, hey, I think this would work a little better if we just sort of shifted it all back or whatever. That would be like a thing that we do. But I think the reality is like, usually we're moving pretty fast, and it's like, I don't really want to like have to like ask him to like go back and like open his session and like tweak things and whatever, unless it's really, really important. And also like he has a really good sense of like pacing and how that all works. So I think like he'll, hear how things come together. And if he hears that something can be a little better, then like he can make those adjustments. And I sort of like trust him, that he really has like a good sense of like how it all should sort of fit together. And it's very like, it's very nice to have to work on a team. I think that's one of the things I like about podcasting specifically is like in film, I'm very used to like having like a relationship with the director, and then, you have your meetings, you talk about what you're going to do, and then you write all your music and you send it. And then it's just like, you're in a black box.
Right.
And like the editors are in a black box, and there's pretty minimal like back and forth. And we just like, I really haven't found that to be the case in podcasts. Like there's just a lot more like integration amongst teams.
Do you think that composing music for podcasts is easier because of they don't have that visual element? Or is it harder maybe because you don't have that playoff?
I was gonna say I think it's harder.
Okay.
Like, yeah, because I do still write music for film, like scored like a TV show last year and short films and a feature every now and again. And it's like when I have time. And I actually think for me, this is a weird thing to say as somebody who works primarily in podcasts, but like I'm a pretty visual person.
Mm-hmm.
So I often find that when I work in film, I'm like, I'll like, like see something in the cut, and like that'll just, whether it's like the right answer or it's just like the Marcus answer, like I'll just sort of know like what I want to go there,
right.
Like can kind of feel it and sort of intuit. And I do think it's a little bit harder with audio only, for me at least, because instead I'm thinking like that like jumping off point, that like spark of inspiration comes from like a story beat, which is like also inspiring. And when you get a good script, then like those sort of moments where you're just like, aha, like that's what it should be. They do come, but it's not as immediate for me. I think I like find myself like sitting in my studio, like just sort of like ponder, and like switching through patches or like fucking with the, filter on a synth or something. And like, I'm just kind of like, well, okay, maybe that's it. Maybe, and then, the beauty of it is like, I'll just like write like 10 pieces and then like maybe like 7 of them will be like a slam dunk, and then the other 3, it's like, maybe we won't use them, or like, right. Maybe it'll go in another project, or so there's a little bit of that. Although my favorite is like, I think like for Blood Forest, we were like, I did my like scoring library and we were having this like meeting to like talk through the pieces. The director, creator, Fred, who's also our really fantastic head of audio production at Realm, was like, we're listening. He was like, yeah, these pieces are all great. It's exactly what I was imagining, sally forth. And then like, there's like one where he's like, yeah, I don't know. Like, it's maybe not quite hitting. Like, I'm not quite sure where we'd use it. And then, and now it's like one of the like main, it's just like one of those things where it's like, you have an idea of like what something should sound like. And then you hear something that's not quite in that idea, but then you start making the thing and you go, like, I guess it was fun because I didn't think it was like, I was like, one thing, it was like, I wrote this and like, we'll see what he thinks. And then, yeah, it's like, now we've been using it like all over the episodes because it just like has like something that really clicks with like one of the things in the story. And it's kind of like a funny thing. But it wasn't the thing that I had been imagining when I wrote the piece. Like that's the sort of interesting thing. Like I do love how like you can kind of like write music in that sort of like abstract of like the sort of structure of a story, and then like find that it has a utility that like you never necessarily imagined, which is kind of interesting. I don't really know like what that says about the process or like, you know, but I think it's kind of cool.
Does the genre of a podcast, you know, whether you're doing like a fiction, kind of a radio play kind of fiction kind of thing, or investigative, or, you know, like an interview thing, do the genres of the podcast like really affect how you come to approach the music?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's sort of more of like a functional, like how you sort of construct things. Like when I've worked on investigative journalism type stuff, like I worked on a show called Conviction American Panic at Gimlet, and I wrote the music for that show. And what that show was about a family in Texas, I believe. It's been a minute since I worked on the show. But yeah, it was about a family in Texas, and there's like allegations against the father that he's like a satanic priest, and the guy ends up going to jail for this. You know, like satanic priest who abuses kids. It turns out that none of it was true. It's completely wow. Fabricated, like did not exist. And so I was like working on this show. It's like a deep reported, investigated story, you know. We had two hosts, Sharon and Julie. And for that show, it was like we were kind of trying to like play with genre a little bit, because like it was like this like whole like satanic panic 80s thing. And you know, so like immediately we're like, oh yeah, like wouldn't it be fun if like the score has all these sort of like shades of like Metallica and Megadeth, right, and like you know, like the bands that like you would associate with the satanic panic, and like the bands that like parents were like afraid for their kids to listen to. But the reality was like the show is hosted by these two women who neither of their vibes is Metallica, you know.
Right.
Like, it's just because it's, you know, and like it just wasn't, you know. It's like very like masculine, heavy, aggressive music, and like I wouldn't say that either of them are like particularly soft spoken, but like it's just not their vibe. So it was trying to find like in that case, because especially like you're not dealing with, there's like a perspective thing where in a hosted show, you were supporting the host and potentially like other people who were like who were being like featured through tape in that show. You're sort of supporting the host's like completely objective, but like mostly objective perspective, right? So it's like a perspective thing. You're like, this is a story being told to you that we have theoretically done a very good job fact checking and making sure. So there's like there's like an objectivity to how this stuff is being presented. So you don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time adding like things to that tape musically. You don't want to like editorialize, right, people's words, particularly like sources. You don't want to editorialize. You don't want to add more than that's there. You don't want to make the host sound like they're doing something that they're not, or saying. You're not trying to add subtext usually, right?
I hear that a lot with the composers that work for documentaries, where
you're trying to very, very similar.
Have this neutral kind of objective tone to it.
Yeah, exactly. So that was something that like, so I think that's sort of like your like non-fiction investigative journalism thing. And like, that's very much like what I learned, like working for This American Life, you know. It's like, that is, you know, you want to just provide rhythm, interest, You want to like give sort of turns in the music that can sort of represent like a change, you know, like a new idea. Like frequently, and I think this is, if you were to like really boil it down, it's like you use music in nonfiction specifically to impose like structural ideas. You know, it's like, okay, I'm going to tell you about something, music, you know, and then when you're done telling when you're done telling the audience about that thing, the music ends. New idea. And you can use music to sort of like segment. And then, yeah, with like fiction, it's completely different. You know, it's like you are providing context and subtext for the action that's happening. I like to think sometimes too, like with TV, like fiction TV, you have, I don't know, like 4 dimensions, right? You visual, you have sound, you have voices, and you have music. And podcasts, you only have 3. And all 3 of the sort of like dimensions that you're working in for a podcast, you were trying to sort of like make up for the lost like 4th like visual one, right, to a certain extent. And I think like music, one can sort of play the role that it plays in like film and TV, where it's rhythm, it's subtext, it's structure, and all these kinds of things. But the other thing that like I think music can really excel in for audio fiction is like music can tell you how something feels to the characters, because you can't see their face, right? You can't like, so if like somebody's like, there's a thing that we're starting to work on, and it's like, you know, it's like there's like a place that is alien to the characters that are in it. And I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking like, okay, like music's job here is to like make you feel how the characters are feeling in this space that feels alien to them.
Right, you're giving their point of view.
Yeah, and so it's very, yeah, I think it's very like point of view, or it can be very point of view oriented, where you're like, or yeah, that's a good example. Or like in this werewolf show, Blood Forest, that I'm sort of currently composing for, and that's starting to release. So there's a couple points where like you're in the perspective of like a werewolf like stalking someone, and like we could like use music to like help you like feel the point of view of the werewolf. You know, it's like, because like sound design can do so much, right? Like you can do all kinds of cool spatial stuff and like make it sound like you're in the bushes or whatever, and you're, you know, like hearing it in your headphones. But there's just like a sort of like emotional resonance that is difficult to capture with sound design. And I also like, I say this is also like someone who's like sound designed a bunch of shows. Right. Like it's just, there's certain things you can't do with sound design, and music can be very good at sort of like picking up that like extra piece of the puzzle and sort of like helping it all kind of come together.
You mentioned it very briefly about your work in film and television. So I just wanted to talk briefly about, you won a local Emmy Award for your work with co-composer Mark
Beckley.
Okay, Mark Beckley. Yeah. On Trending Nature, a documentary series focused on environmental knowledge of indigenous people of California. So what was the process like composing for that show with Mark?
Yeah, it's funny. So Mark, I've known Mark for a long time. Mark was another assistant for the composer that I started working with when I first moved to New York, Marcelo Zarvos. And we obviously stayed in touch over the years. And when Tending Nature came to me, I was right in the middle of like another large project. And I really, like, I didn't want to turn it down, because it was like the first time that I had been like asked to score a TV show. Because it's like an episodic TV show, and it's something I've always wanted to do. Like as the head composer, I've worked on a bunch of other TV shows, and I was like, I know that if I do this by myself, like I'm gonna just get like completely slammed. So I reached out to Mark, And we had like done a couple other like little small projects, together before that. And he had done some orchestration work. Mark is also like an incredible orchestrator. Like he's worked on, like he orchestrated Judas and the Black Messiah. Wow. Like a lot of, he's really like top tier. He's an amazing composer as well, but his orchestration work is really like nuts. But yeah, so I called him and I was like, obviously like we know we work well together, and I have this thing and I need a little help with it. So he came in and we ended up splitting the project 50-50 down the middle. And what was interesting about that show is that, and I'm actually finding that a lot of, because like my other sort of like work, like particularly film work, does tend to be in like the documentary space, and I'm finding a lot of documentary filmmakers actually like to work in a similar way that podcasts work, where you provide them with a bunch of tracks that you've composed specifically for the project, and then an editor will sort of edit the film using your tracks. And that's how Tending Nature actually ended up working, where like we spent quite a while working up a bunch of like this really nice scoring library. And then that became what ended up in the show. Now, once basically like we did this library, Corbett, the editor, who's like a director and film editor that I've worked with a lot over the years. Once he is really, really good at editing music. Like, I don't know if I've worked with a film editor who has like a more like musical sense. He just really, he uses music in ways that like really like enhances this, like your music. So like, I'll like go and like watch the cut and I'm like, damn, like I never would have thought to do that, but
I
wrote
it just that. Works. Wow.
Yeah. And so, so he edited all the music in, and then he sent it back to us. And then we kind of like went and did all the sort of like detailing. Mm-hmm. So it's this sort of like interesting process that like when I first was getting into scoring, I don't know like if it really existed. Like I think that like my understanding is this is sort of like how like Trent Reznor works on films, like they just lock themselves in a room for a month and they write all this music and then they just give it to the editing department. And like just because of I think it's partially just like a deadline thing. Like a lot of these projects that I work on, either with podcasts or with doc films or TV shows or whatever, it's a pretty like quick turnaround. And like sometimes it's just like, if you can just kick out a bunch of tracks and then the editor can just kind of get them in place, you're not doing that step where you're like, okay, here's an edited piece, score to it. And then you send it to them and they go, well, I don't really like this one. And this wasn't really what I was thinking, it should be. And then you have like this like back and forth thing that happens where instead it's like Corbett edits the piece together using our music. So he's choosing tonally what he wants because he knows what he wants because he's the editor. And then maybe he'll come back to us and say, hey, I need 2 more pieces that feel kind of like this because I feel like we don't have them. And it's a interesting thing.
When you're sending over pieces, are the editors getting stems? Like, do they have a lot of freedom, or is it you just send pieces?
No, we usually will do stereos. I think like stems, because we know that we're going to get the pieces kicked back to us to do like the final edit. I think stems would be a little overboard, and it would also just selfishly like having had to rebuild somebody's stem edit in my session before. It's not a fun thing to do.
Right.
If it's like, oh, he cut a bar here and kind of, that's fine. That's easy. You just cut the bar and you shift everything together. Yeah. And I think for like, I haven't met like met and worked with editors who are very musical and have very musical senses of how they sort of sync everything up. But that sort of instrument to instrument level of granularity, I don't think is super helpful to anyone. And I think that that sort of granularity is sort of better left to like Mark and I when it gets kicked back to us, and then we'll do that sort of finessing and like massaging to make everything like work really nicely together. But yeah, I know it's nice to sort of like get to like kick back and forth between mediums and sort of let the work in one place like inform the other and vice versa and things. I mean,
it's I feel like podcasts last 10 years kind of exploded, and I have all these big companies kind of pouring into the scene, and it's definitely a changed landscape than it was 10 years ago.
Very much so. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, like I was at Gimlet when it got acquired by Spotify, and that was a very interesting time to be at the company, and like there was a lot of good, and then obviously like it's tricky when big companies come in and they have like I don't know, like whether it's justified or it's not or whatever, it's like they have things that they're trying to do, and like if those things don't necessarily like align with what the company that they're acquiring is trying to do, it gets tricky. And there's like a sort of built-in tension there that I think, in some cases, like for a while, like really supercharged and made things really sort of like exciting. Because it was like suddenly like, wow, we do not have to worry about money.
Yeah, that's always a good part.
Then the flip is like, yeah, but like they're going to put all the shows behind a paywall I guess it's not a paywall, but put all the shows, exclusively on one platform, and you're going to lose a bunch of your audience, and like that's tricky. Yeah, but I will say it was very like comforting, like because like we were with Spotify like during the pandemic and like that whole thing, like it was comforting to be at like a very like stable thing where everyone was kind of like, okay, cool, like we're here and we're riding this thing out, and it made it a time that I think for a lot of people was like super tough. Made it a little bit easier, good and bad.
right
I think in terms of like the overall space, it's a very like exciting place to be right now. There's so many things happening, and like it's cool to see. Like, I mean, I think that was the thing that made me so excited to come over to Realm, was like a whole company that's only doing fiction podcasts, like because like basically like I think up until I guess Q Code is another one that's out there that like does just fiction, but like until very recently, like fiction was just like a thing that like some companies had like a little division doing. It's like Wondery, they have a couple shows. My wife works at Wondery, so they're but like and like Gimlet had a little fiction department, and they were putting out a couple shows a year, and like I actually worked on a couple Gimlet shows, which is really fun. To the point that like there's enough interest in the scene that like it can justify like an entire company of people just making fiction podcasts is like a really cool thing, and like cool to be able to like kind of step into that and like make fiction all the time has been like such a treat. It's like because I think like which is like going back to like the top of our conversation, like I got into this because I wanted I saw Gladiator, like and I was like, wow, the stuff the music does. And like I absolutely love doing documentary stuff, and I'll continue to do documentary stuff. Like it's like talking about like another featured documentary with a director today, and like maybe that'll happen, we'll see. But like getting to sort of it's almost like a return to my roots a little.
Yeah, it's full circle.
Like, yeah, and it's great. I mean, like, I can't really like talk about the details, but like, in August, Spotify and Warner Brothers and DC Comics announced like they're doing like a Harley Quinn podcast, and like I'm writing music for that.
Wow.
Like, that is, like that's a very exciting thing. I'm doing a lot more on the show as well, but it's just nice to like be like telling these like sort of like big exciting stories, and that you really get to like, it's like there's like a certain like restrained quality to narrative nonfiction and documentary, and so like we get to sort of go a little big. Yeah. And that's great. I mean, it's exciting and it's refreshing, and I think it sort of like keeps my brain, nimble.
Right.
So I have to like keep like figuring out, like rethinking what I'm doing and how I'm engaging with storytelling and all that, stuff. It's like I'm like a little like ADD or something. I like to constantly like be changing and being challenged, and like
that's a great way to live. It's constantly changing, constantly challenging, constantly evolving.
It keeps it, I know, this is like the joke. It's like keeps me out of trouble, like just I have to like reset. So amazing. Yeah, it's great. And I do think that like the fiction space is so young. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because like fiction storytelling is like one of the older versions of media, like Orson Welles' War of the World, like the OG. Like that was, I should probably know the date, but that was, it's like that's very old. It's like audio fiction is not new by any means, but this like current crop of fiction is, and like how it's being done, it does a little bit feel like we're still in the process of like learning how to like what the rules are, or we're writing the rules to a certain extent. And I think it's amazing too, because it's like working with different directors. It's like, okay, like Fred Greenhalgh, the director of Blood Forest, the werewolf show that I'm working on. It's like the way that he sort of moves the story along and like very fluidly like cuts between characters. It's like almost like filmic in this way that like it's very clear, and it like kind of blows my mind, like because I've also like I wrote a show last year that Gimlet put out, like an audio fiction story that I also like scored and sound designed. It was ridiculous. Like it was a ridiculous thing to do all by myself, but it was really fun. But like seeing how like Fred on Blood Forest like moves the story along, like absolutely breaks my brain. It's just It's amazing. Like it just works in a way that I think is really exciting. And it's something that I've never experienced before in the fiction space, and like that's cool, because then I'm like going and like scoring these scenes, and it's like I've never done this before. Like
it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's really cool. And I do think that there is like that aspect of just like sort of watching and like seeing how the scene is growing, and like all of these people who are like just putting, like a ton of their brain power into figuring out how this can work and what you can do with it. And turns out there's a lot that you can do that hasn't really been explored yet.
That's amazing.
And that's like a exciting spot to be, where you can kind of like discover that.
Yeah, maybe these will be the things that be talked about in 10 years, 20 years from now, talking about
I mean, I
being
hope
on
so.
the ground floor of this stuff.
I like trying to be like influential, but I do like the idea that like we can set some cool precedents that like other people can play around with and, build off of. And I hope that's what we're, like what we're doing with some of the stuff that we're doing. And some of it, we're just having fun.
Right.
That's the other thing. It's like, we're not thinking about it too hard. We're just like, oh yeah, werewolves, like, or eating someone. Or like, just, yeah, what can I sound that sounds creepy and terrifying and huge and like, and that is a very like just satisfying, like
right.
finding the right like crunch, synth sound.
I just wanted to give you an opportunity here at the end to just plug some of the stuff that you're working on. You mentioned Blood Forest.
Yeah, Blood Forest is definitely the big one. The Harley Quinn show, there's not really like any information other than that it's happening. Christina Ricci plays Harley Quinn, and she's amazing. But that'll be coming out at some point. But I wrote the music for that as well as serving as the audio producer for the project, and I did a lot of the sound design. And then so Blood Forest is currently out on all podcast platforms. It's an amazingly fun, creepy werewolf romp set in Maine, which is where I'm from, which is nice. Also really kind of nice. You get to like enjoy
very Stephen King. He loves everything.
Yeah. Yes. Fred and I both have like a very like major like affinity for Stephen King. So yeah, like we get to kind of like play in his backyard a little bit. Yeah, so that's out right now. It's currently releasing. I think episode 2 comes out tomorrow. What is today? Nope, it doesn't come out tomorrow. Today is Monday. Comes out on Friday.
It'll probably be out when this comes out. Whenever.
Sweet. Okay, out. So it'll be out when this comes out. Great. I'm sure, a bunch of Blood Forest will be out. Yeah, those are the 2 big things. There were a couple other Realm shows that I'm really excited about. It's a show called Blood and Gold right now that I served as a music supervisor on, and we brought an amazing composer by the name of Juan Carlo Enriquez, who wrote this incredible score for sort of Western show about the real life person that like Legend of Zorro was based off of. That show is really great. His score, it's sort of Gustavo Santaolalla and like mixed with like really crunchy, cool like Western vibes. We have another one called Echo Park that I was music supervisor on, that Martin Fowler, who was the guy who originally turned me on to This American Life, wrote music for us for. It's like a sort of like near future Blade Runner detective story starring Harry Shum Jr.
Nice.
Who's in like Crazy Rich Asians, and I think he's on Grey's Anatomy now, which is kind of fun. I mean, it's the awesome thing about Realm is there's like always stuff coming out, and it's all pretty fun and exciting, and we're very there's a bunch of sort of stuff like in the wings that is probably going to be announced in like pretty short order that like I can't talk about yet, but I'm like super stoked.
Well, we'll be
for
super
when people
excited
find out about it
to share that when it comes out.
Yeah, I think that's it. Oh, I guess the one other thing I would throw out, I wrote and produced a show. It was like the last thing I did while I was at Gimlet. It's a show called Stone Island, which is like a feature-length horror podcast. So I like wrote it as if it were like a movie. So it's about an hour and a half long.
Wow.
It's like a ghost story set on an island in Maine during like a once in a century type storm. That I wrote the music for it, I sound designed, I directed.
Wow. You're doing everything. How'd you find time to do this interview?
Man, I carved out the time. It was such a compelling ask. I was like, hell yeah, I'll find the time. yeah, so yeah, this show's called Stone Island. It's on Spotify. And yeah, I'm really proud of it. It's great. It's great, like listening in like the October.
Yeah, we'll be sure to link all of these in the podcast.
Yeah, that's it. I think that's all the main things, and then like I said, I think in a couple months there'll be a few more cool things.
Amazing. Well, it has been absolutely fantastic talking to you, and
dude, thank you.
Hearing about this, I feel like unsung, like people don't talk about podcast music at all. But it's great.
We're working on it. Working on it. Yeah, I know. It's I think it's just sort of like part of like being part of a scene that's like a little bit like rising, like give it a couple of years and like
sure.
There's some really cool stuff going on right now too, like the composer for the Sandman show that Audible just did with Neil Gaiman, like they just recorded like part of the score with an orchestra.
Wow.
There's like cool things happening, and I think it's starting to raise up the stature of the like quote like art form a little bit.
Right.
We'll see what happens.
Awesome. Well, thanks again.
Yeah, man. It's really appreciated the ask, and you asked me to be on here, and it was really fun talking.
Awesome. It was amazing hearing about Marcus's process for composing and his work across all sorts of different mediums. You can, of course, listen to everything we mentioned in the link dump in this episode's description. Thanks for listening to The Scorekeepers. The Scorekeepers is produced by Daniel Farrell Music and Sound, with graphic and visual design by Patrick Farrell. Scorekeepers is proudly hosted and recorded using Zencaster. Make sure you subscribe to hear new episodes of The Scorekeepers wherever you listen. And be sure to rate and review this episode to help us find new listeners. Thanks for listening.